Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out and joining our live tape discussion. Feel free to get yourself a beer and find a seat. Our beer tonight is a New Old Lompoc Centennial IPA, which they very generously donated this evening. Woohoo! Please put your contact information in the fishbowl, which Karen will be coming up and passing around. If you put your information in there, it will be added to the mailing list for New Oregon and the White Stag Block Talks. Your information will never be shared, and you can unsubscribe at any time. After the Q&A, we'll be drawing names to win a prize. So stick around because you have to be present to win. You might win a copy of Patient 002 by Floyd Skloot, or a 3-DVD set from Brian Libby, or a personal tour from Nan Curtis of her current exhibition at the Merrillhurst Art Gym, or her Caseworks installation at Reed College's Cooley Gallery. Very nice. Thank you, everybody, for that. All right, so you can take a look if you want at the tables in the back, and we're going to get started in just a second. Actually, I think maybe we'll get started now because you're all sitting down. So welcome to Portland on Portland, Word Plus Image. It's co-presented by the New Oregon Interview Series and the White Stag Block Talks. Tonight we're going to be talking with Nan Curtis, Brian Libby, and Floyd Skloot about how Portland's identity is reflected in the arts and is communicated to the outside world. There are a lot of benefits to living here, as you probably know. Lower cost of living, livability, and a strong creative community. And we've gotten a lot of attention in recent years from the New York Times and other media for our distinctive creative culture. Tonight, we'll investigate what exactly makes our creative culture different from other American cities. First, I'd like to thank our University of Oregon sponsors, the School of Architecture and Allied Arts, Academic Affairs, and the Library and Learning Commons. You can find out more about the University of Oregon's BFA degrees in product design, digital art, and architecture at the back of the room. And you can visit the library anytime to borrow books, read magazines, study, or work. It is open to the public. Thanks to the event co-host Karen Monroe, head of the Library and Learning Commons, and also to editor Tiffany Lee Brown. Thank you so very much, you guys. So we're going to invite each of our panelists up here to share just a little peek at their work before we start our discussion. Let's bring Nan Curtis up to the stage. Nan Curtis. Nan is a multidisciplinary artist and independent curator whose work explores ideas about home, place, family, childhood, and social relationships. Curtis has exhibited both nationally and internationally at venues including Consolidated Works in Seattle, the Farm Gallery in Philadelphia, with RSDS at the Knot Dance Festival in Nottingham, England, the Melbourne Art Centre in Australia, and locally at PICA. Nan is also known around Portland for her work at PNCA, the Pacific Northwest College of Art. She was chair of the sculpture department and curated the Feldman Gallery from 2000 to 2006. Welcome, Nan.
Thank you.
So we're going to look at a few images.
I thought the few images that I did want to bring to you guys tonight in particular are shows that I have going on right now. For some reason, a confluence of shows have come together, and I have 3 shows simultaneously. This one is at Reed College and is a collaboration with my husband, Martin Houston. And at Reed, they have a project called Caseworks. It's curated by Stephanie Snyder in their gallery up there. And it's their bookcases that are inside of the library. Typically, they're glass, and you see through them, and they have shelves in them, and you can fill the shelves with books or other kind of memorabilia. But in the case of our project, we worked on the dynamic that exists both between the cases and if you were sort of to remove the case as you know it, case in general. And in this case, we lined it with photographs so that they became an object in and of themselves. The project is called The Space Between Us, and it really emphasizes, again, that space between the two. I'm looking back at the other person, and maybe the next image gives you the kind of the sweet view. Oh, yeah, of me looking back at this person who's not quite looking at me. And so we're trying to create a tension between the two people that are in there. It's particularly interesting because we're in this community and people know us, but it's not necessarily related specifically to that. It could really, it's just about two people and what the interaction is between two people. So that's up right now until the end of June and is running in conjunction with the show Scarecrow that's up there, which is an excellent show, and I highly recommend it. I think it's one of the best visual art contemporary shows that we've had in town in eons. Andy Warhol, Rauschenberg, Daniel Sperry, Linda Benglis, Hans Bellmer, like an incredible show, you guys. So as much as my project is very good, I highly recommend the other one too. So then I also am in a show at Marylhurst College right now called Motherload, and it is features 7 women artists from the region, not specifically from Portland. All of us relate to momness, if that's a word, in one way or another, whether it be about our mother, that we are mothers, or that we have children. And so my work does a little bit of all of that. Again, you heard what Nora said, that there's family and childhood and relationships and stuff like that. I lost my mother 2 years ago, and I've been doing a lot of work about that. She was a mad collector of purses, and so I took all of them, and I have 81 of her purses in my studio, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with them, but I open them up, and I find things like the cigarette wrapper from her cigarette, and all of a sudden this is like the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life, and so I framed it in a shadow box, and that's just what it is. It's called My Mother's Cigarette Wrapper. This one is part of an ongoing series I do called Performative Portraits, where I have those boxes of memorabilia that we all keep, and we don't know why. And now that I'm reflecting back on this stuff that I move all the time with me, and I want to throw it away, but God forbid someone at Goodwill found it, or, you know, like I wouldn't do that, and I don't want it to be in the garbage dump. And so I've been trying to reinvigorate these objects in some way, and specifically by redefining them in new ways. In this particular case, these are all my photo albums, and they are wedged into a bookshelf that's too tight so that you can't pull them out. And so really it's simply about being the object that it is right there. And then this one is called Mom Rocket. It also is in the Marylhurst show, and it's kind of a collaboration mentally between me and my mother, as if I might sit inside of this thing. It was built at 5'10", which in my memory was how tall my mom was, but my sisters told me I'm wrong, that she's actually smaller, which I think is interesting. So my perception of her was actually much bigger than she actually is. And then I have an upcoming show in 2 weeks at a space called Work Sound, which is run by an artist in town named Modu Dieng. And his shows are particularly event-driven, and so it's really about the opening. And it's on May 7th, 6 to 9. They always go to about midnight. And that show is called House Arrest. It's curated by a local artist named M.K. Guth, and it has artists in it that have a lot to do with issues of the house and home and different interpretations of what that is. I will be showing a series of forts that I built. And so this is one of several pieces that will be exhibited in there. I have a website. You can check that out, nancurtis.com. I'm making a lot of work lately, so that's what I know.
Thank you so much, Nan. Okay, next up, let's bring Brian Libby up to the stage. Brian's photography and his writing on architectural, visual arts, and film has been published in the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, Dwell, Architectural Record, Premiere, and the Oregonian, among many others. His award-winning short films have screened at the Northwest Film and Video Festival, the Portland International Film Festival, and at Exploding Cinema in London. The films were also the subject of a 2007 retrospective at the Portland Art Museum. Brian's photographs were exhibited at the American Institute of Architects in 2003, and he has a new DVD collection coming out along the way in the next few months. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
So, Brian, before we show your award-winning short, The Falls, could you just tell us a little bit about what your intention was in the piece?
Sure. The Falls is kind of like all of my work, which stems from the fact that, well, it's really simple. I have a small video camera that can fit, in a pocket like this, and has. And I just like taking my camera with me when I go places. And, there was a part of this decade where I got to do a lot of traveling kind of in Asia and Europe, and so I made a lot of short films that ended up being at that length. And the last couple of years, it's been stuff more in the Northwest because I haven't been traveling internationally, but we may go to the beach for a weekend or something like that. And that was the case with The Falls, the film we're going to see here. We were just taking an out-of-town visitor, my sort of pseudo-sister-in-law, to Multnomah Falls, and I ended up filming it just because I enjoy filming stuff that I go to. But the way I ended up presenting it in the film is, as we watch it here, I think people might find that it's edited in kind of a jarring way, where the film kind of gets you hooked on just kind of looking at water coming down in a really kind of soothing way, and then there's a cut, that feels kind of jarring and almost subliminal. And I don't know quite how I arrived at doing this, but the idea was that when I go to a place like Multnomah Falls, I feel like I'm getting sucked into the hypnotic feel of the water coming down, but then the real world always creeps in, like there's some little kid screaming, or there's a big group of tourists, or something happens where I get distracted. And so that's how I was looking for a way in this film to kind of present that idea. I called it The Falls, but at one point it was actually this sounds so pretentious now, but it was gonna be called Solace Interrupted. But that was kind of an expression of the idea that I had, that I love getting sucked in and just staring at Multnomah Falls like it's some sort of you are getting sleepy. But then, it never lasts quite the way I want it to. And I think the reason what I enjoy about making films in general is the editing down of real life. What I enjoy doing is taking a place that I visit. I may film for hours at a train window or something like that. And but it's not always fun traveling for like 17 hours straight or whatever. And I can edit this video down to where it's like 3 minutes of like the coolest stuff out the window, and or like the footage going really fast, and I can sort of reduce. I really love traveling, but it's always a love-hate relationship, or going anywhere, even if it's a day trip. I may be in traffic just on the way to Multnomah Falls and mad at some other driver. But with these films, I can sort of manipulate my world and reduce it to kind of its bare essence. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, let's take a look.
And this is only like 2 or 3 minutes or something.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, and let's bring Floyd Skloot up to the stage. My consciousness feels a little altered, Brian. Floyd is a creative nonfiction writer, poet, novelist, and critic. He has published 17 books and won 3 Pushcart Prizes, a PEN USA Literary Award, 2 Pacific Northwest Bookseller Association Book Awards, and 2 Oregon Book Awards. His work has been included in the Best American Essays, Best American Science Writing, and in fact, the Best of Creative Nonfiction, among other anthologies. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Harper's, and other major literary journals in the US and abroad. Welcome, Floyd.
Thank you.
And Floyd has a little excerpt for us from In the Shadow of Memory.
That's it? I'm going to read a passage from a chapter in the Shadow of Memory. The chapter is called Wild in the Woods. And I wrote it about 9 years ago. From 1993 until 2006, my wife Beverly and I lived in the middle of 20 acres of woods in a little round house that she built. It was in Yamhill County. So during those years, we were living in the middle of essentially nowhere. And those were very important years for me. In 1988, on a plane trip from Portland to Washington, D.C., I contracted a virus that targeted my brain and left me totally disabled. It's been 21 years now, almost 22, and I'm still a work in progress. For me, living in the woods was an essential part of trying to put myself back together. My neurological damage, besides balance problems, included serious cognitive problems. My IQ dropped 20%. My abstract reasoning and word-finding powers were diminished. And so in the passage that I'm going to read to you, this is an attempt to place where I was, both in space and in place. The healing that I was in the process of doing and that I felt could only be done in the place where I was doing it. When the coastal wind blows hard through the trees and I see them swaying, I lose my balance, even in bed, because the damage to my brain has affected the system by which I hold myself in place. For me, to retain balance requires work and a focus on what holds still. It requires a recognition of limits and place. I need to stop thinking altogether in order to do it right. Seeing those trees every morning also reminds me that this is a land of second growth. Much of our hill was harvested many years ago, and I live within the density of what grew back. It's a good place for me to live, a workshop in survival, in coming back from damage. A person doesn't escape to a place like this. It's not exile, it's home. I'm not getting any better, but I'm also not getting any worse. At 54, after 13 years of living with static dementia, I've discovered just where that leaves me. Since I cannot presume that I will remember anything, I must live fully in the present. Since I cannot presume that I will understand anything, I must feel and experience my life in the moment and not always press to formulate ideas about it. Since I cannot escape my body and the limits it has imposed on me, I must learn to be at home in it. Since I can do so little, it's good to live in a place where there's so little to do. And since I cannot presume that I will master anything I do, I must relinquish mastery as a goal and seek harmony instead.
Thank you, Floyd. I think it's so interesting how the woods provided this place, this very specific kind of place for you to do that healing.
Yes, and every instinct that I had told me not to go there. When Beverly and I were first together, I lived in downtown Portland, and I thought that's exactly where I needed to be. I needed to be able to walk to all the services that I needed, the pharmacy, the doctor, the bookstore, anything I might need, I needed to be right there. I needed to be in the hubbub, or else I would lose my connection to life, I thought. And then I got together with Beverly, and she had this place in the woods, and I went out there and found it to be exactly what I needed. And everything that I thought I needed to be in the city for was, in fact, holding me back from being able to put myself back together.
Thank you for that. So, we've seen a little bit of your guys' work, just a quick look. So I'm curious, would you guys have made that work if you were living someplace else?
Should I
Go
answer?
for it.
That's a really good question, and I think I would have. I hope it's not a cop-out to say I would have made sort of a different version of the same thing, or whatever the opposite is of that. And that there's something about what I do that is independent of place, but there's also a lot of what I do that is indispensable in terms of this area shaping me. I remember going in college to New York University and making a lot of friends who were in the film school there. I was just a liberal arts student, but I was sort of dazzled by the friends I made who were studying to become movie directors and that sort of thing. And all these years later, I graduated in 1995, and with exception to one kind of friend who did end up becoming a director, his name's Eli Roth, most of them haven't ever made a film since they got out of college. Maybe they have a script they're shopping around or that sort of thing. But I felt a stronger sense than they did, I guess, even though I didn't get the chance to study film like they did. I had sort of more the sense of being an outsider in a way that I think growing up in Oregon really was a part of, and that I think that outsiderness is also a big part of Portland's present DNA and part of what we'll talk about, and that I just sort of felt like, well, I want to just go do this. I don't aspire to make a Hollywood film that sounds like something that a corporation generates. I just want to go make a movie with either my Super 8 camera or my video camera, and I want to do every part of it and edit it and shoot it and just do whatever the hell I want. And I think there's a kind of spirit, both of the outsider and also even though it's an overused phrase, the kind of do-it-yourself culture here that I think is intrinsic to Oregon and being kind of a little bit isolated from the rest of the major capitals like New York and LA. I think there's a kind of spirit that has always existed here. When you and I were talking a couple of days ago, I remember bringing up an editorial in the Oregonian that I read like 10 or 15 years ago, and it was called The Gore-Tex Vortex. And it was the idea of the piece was that at a certain point years ago during the Great Migration, the Oregon Trail became a kind of fork in the road. And even though this is an oversimplification, the hypothesis was that those who wanted to become rich and famous headed south to California, and those that wanted to do something like start a farm and a family came to Oregon, where they were hearing about rich valleys that they could, with great soil and that stuff. And so I think there's an essence of the outsider in Oregon, and the landscape then is a whole other conversation that plays into it. But that would be my answer, that that there's something essential there. But I also had to get away from Oregon, having grown up. I actually grew up coincidentally in Yamhill County, and I had the opposite thing that you did. I grew up amongst the woods and that sort of thing, and I had this yearning to go to the city, and I had to go to New York City when I was 18 and kind of experience something entirely different in order to kind of appreciate what I had in Oregon. Mm-hmm. And so when I came back to Portland and moved here 12 years ago, I really consciously thought of Portland as a kind of happy medium where I could have some of the kind of urbanity and cosmopolitan, the rich cultural experience of having bookstores within a block or a pizza by the slice place, and I loved that. But I felt so disconnected from the landscape and from nature being in New York, and I wanted a little bit smaller of a city where I felt like, I really can do it. I really can become a journalist or a filmmaker or whatever, and I don't need, a $5 million budget to do it, or that sort of thing, or anybody's validation. So this is a really long-winded answer at this point, but that's how I see it.
I'll chime in, and when Nora sort of set us up with a couple of questions before, and I think my basic question, or answer to that question is yes, I would have made it just about anywhere, except I had a little eye-opening experience this weekend where my dad came to visit me. I'm not from Oregon, I'm originally from Kentucky. And I went to graduate school in Ohio, which we called our vortex, and that wasn't a nice word, at least in referring to Ohio. And we really were fleeing and coming out here. We keep wondering when we get to call ourselves natives. Sorry, because we just love it out here. But I realized that my dad was standing in front of one of my pieces, shielding the audience from it, because he thought he was embarrassed for me. And I realized I probably wouldn't have made that work in Ohio. I mean, the liberal attitude has afforded me a huge leeway to kind of do what I want to do. And my work already resides in a line that becomes just a little too personal and a little too revealing and all that kind of stuff. And I probably would not have gone there someplace other than in Oregon. But I'm so much a part of this community now, and this is where I grew up, so I don't even know that. Actually, I think, yeah, I'd make it anywhere, but that may not be true, and my dad revealed that to me the other day. So I think we do have a certain leeway here that we're not even aware of.
Yeah, I think for me, obviously, the work that I read is so rooted in that particular place that it would not have been possible to do that work any other place. And that's probably true for almost all of my writing. It's so rooted in place, and the place that it's rooted in, if it's in the present, is here. But there's a deeper answer, I think. I don't believe I could have written anything in the condition that I was in if I wasn't in a place that left me alone, that placed no time demands on me, that had no expectations of me, that just enfolded me, which the woods did, which the love I have with Beverly did, and I think Oregon's artistic and literary community did. I had been a writer here before I got sick, and people knew that I was sick and respected my retreat into the woods and into myself. And I think that was very important to my capacity to get anything done at all as I began to slowly figure out how to write with a fragmented memory system and a fragmented capacity to think or form abstract thoughts, that I needed the kind of time and freedom and lack of expectation that this place gave me.
Did you find the artistic community here to be accepting of that process?
It's probably a simple and a complex answer. The simple answer is probably yes, they were accepting. But the deeper answer is they probably didn't care. Mm-hmm. I think people are ready to receive the work you issue, and they're ready to wait until you issue it. I think there's that kind of remarkable sense of community where there isn't necessarily competition, there isn't necessarily expectation, there's nothing. There's just, what do you got? When do you have it? And I found that to be very liberating.
I know, Brian, you mentioned sort of a similar sense of that here you can do whatever you want, and that's a little different than being, for example, let's just take film, you know, in New York or LA, or even you could say Bollywood, where most of the money and infrastructure is tied up. And I think most of us here in our own disciplines are working far away from where that kind of infrastructure is. How does that affect how you guys make your work?
I think so much of what this comes back to is trying to strike the right balance. One of the ways in which we've talked about that so far has been the balance between city and nature. Sometimes when you're in city, you miss nature, and sometimes when you're in nature, you miss city. And I think there's a similar balance that we're all trying to strike between kind of being a citizen of like your neighborhood and your city, and then also being a citizen of the U.S., and then all the connections you have with people potentially all over the world through like Facebook or all that stuff. Like, you know, I'm sometimes in more regular contact with a friend of mine in London than I am with my mom, who lives an hour's drive away. You know, not that I never see my mom or anything like that, but you know, it's always. I think you have so many choices, either as an artist or a writer or just a person, as to what you want your focus to be and what you want around you. And for me, even though maybe it's a cliche, I always return to the idea of balance, and that you know, it's a constant fluid thing that I want to experience, kind of a spectrum of being by myself. Like Floyd was talking a second ago about needing to be alone, and that's very much necessary for me on a daily basis, even to have some alone time. And in a certain respect, I also feel like sooner or later I have to get out of the city and go somewhere, and that's I think part of what attracts people here, along with a huge series of other factors like affordability and the urban pedestrian fabric of Portland and stuff, is some of that ease with which we can strike that balance, particularly between city and nature, and that because of things like Portland's urban growth boundary that reduces sprawl, we're able to, you know, preserve farmland and woods conceptually and that sort of thing, and that you can be out in a place that feels like the middle of nowhere a lot sooner here than if you lived in New York. I mean, sure, there are wooded areas of New Jersey, but you know, do you even want to go there? So to me, that's what it's about, is finding the right balance. And I could say that about you know, so many different parts of my life. And for me, you know, it's different for different authors, but I think one thing we all share, whether it's Floyd's writing or Nan's artwork or my films, is they're all to varying degrees pretty intensely personal. And you know, that's really what art is a personal expression. And so it's largely about creating the right set of conditions for yourself that can, you know, allow you to make work, like economically, and pay your rent and stuff, but also to be inspired and be, you know, sort of feel secure and comfortable. So, you know, I think that's like the sort of coalescence that is exciting about Portland. Is it feels like there's a better mix right now than most cities in terms of, you know, we'll always have Mount Hood, but now we have better restaurants too, and you know, I think it's kind of a transformational moment for Portland, especially in an exciting way.
You don't have to be in the center of anything anymore. You know, with the internet and travel and how easy it is, and there's so many different ways to get your fingers into that kind of pot anymore. It's less and less and less and less and less important. But traveling is probably a pretty critical component always, to go and see that and to see it within context and where it is. But I had lots of people tell me that they never saw my show because they took great images and put them on the website. I was like, okay, that's one way to do it. But so there's lots of ways around that anymore. But and there's just so much access to shows in China that are happening of contemporary, you know, young Chinese artists or whatever it is, and we know about that happening here. And I didn't go to China to see that. So, if you have your finger in that pot, it becomes less important to be in the center of Bollywood or New York or any of that kind of stuff. And being an educator, I'm exposed to a lot of that a lot of the time. So, I don't get out of Portland a lot, but I know a lot about what's going on out there.
Yeah, it is different to see things in their place. I remember Michael Brophy telling me about going to see the Goya paintings in Spain and going to the museum where the paintings were, and along the way seeing the light and the trees, and then he went to the museum, it was the same light and the same trees in the paintings, and realizing that Goya was making place-based work too. You know, it's just a more well-known place. I think you realize those things from going to see them in their own sites. And you know, I think maybe people are doing that more now. At least people from Portland are doing that more than they used to.
I have a bunch of students at Marina Abramovic has a retrospective up at MoMA right now that's pretty pivotal and incredible, and I'm getting uploads on they're like, look, I'm sitting with her right now, and I mean, the connection between the real-time moment and me and them being there is all of 30 seconds on the internet, and it feels very real. It feels very right there, even though I'm not standing in MoMA with them.
Do you think that exposure has changed the kind of work that's made here?
Yeah, I think it probably inevitably has. It's much more sophisticated. I know that to be true anyway. The work here is much more sophisticated, and people are coming in from the outside, and the conversations have shifted, and I don't think we're quite so caught up. There used to be this kind of thing that people in Portland felt kind of little brother, or as if they weren't quite good enough, or it was too small of a community, or they didn't have access to, or all of that, and I don't hear that conversation so much anymore. There's lots of people coming in, art colleges are growing, people are seeing, you know, films are getting made here. There's just a huge breakdown, I think, of that sort of creative community, which used to feel very compartmentalized. Here's fine arts over here, and this is film, and apparently White and Kennedy's doing something that I'm not really sure about, and it all feels like a big, not a melting pot, let's call it a salad, where everybody's coming together more than blending, you know?
Yeah, it seems also that the audience coming to see your work in its place is important as well. Has that been something that's been important in your work? The role of the audience who's actually located there in your site to see what you're doing?
Yes, it's definitely important because I really have to consider them, because my work can be kind of confrontational and a little difficult. I'm not going to put hard work out in front of kids because I'm a mom, and I wouldn't do that. But, you know, so yes, I do consider our audience a lot, but again, that audience has grown a lot, and there's a lot more flexibility about what we can show. So that has that much more delocalized kind of sensibility, I think.
I think you're always a better artist or writer or anyone if you think about how somebody else from a different perspective might react to it. I find as I try to answer that question, you know, how the audience influences my work, I sort of thought of an answer that was to say they don't influence it at all, but then I realized that I could have said the opposite too, and that I really enjoy the fact that when I'm working, I play this game with myself that it's only for me, that the video I'm making is for an audience of one, and that I sort of pretend that no one is ever going to look at it. And so if I want to make a short about Multnomah Falls that's kind of, you know, in a certain respect, just in terms of your eyes watching it, kind of almost hard to watch. Like, I can just screw around and do that, and it doesn't matter. But at the same time, I think about the fact that before I was making films, I spent 6 or 7 years reviewing films, and I really was influenced by the fact that I would go to these film festivals. Kind of one of the main things I reviewed when I was writing movie reviews was reviewing things at like the Northwest Film Center, and kind of not feature-length movies so much, but kind of local shorts and stuff kind of like the stuff I make now. And I just felt like there were so many short films that I saw as an audience member that were like a 10 or 15 minute movie when they should have been 3 or 4 minutes, or that a lot of times you can be a little bit, from me and short films, one of the things I like about it is that I can sort of get in and get out with an idea where I think you can be a little bit more provocative if you're not going to, in certain respects, if you're not going to make people, there for a long time. That I can make a 3-minute film that's somebody would watch, but if I did it for a half an hour, they would probably walk out. So I think if you're an artist, or a writer, you want to keep your eyes and ears open, but it remains rooted in a kind of personal experience.
Floyd, I know you have I understand you have a pretty devoted and national following. Does that awareness of that audience enter into your work at all?
It doesn't influence the work as it's being written. I'm writing, I believe, to try to understand and make discoveries about my experience. And there's no room in that process for me to worry about or think about readers at that time. Although I know that I want readers to complete the act with me once I've made my discoveries. So there's that. But one thing I discovered as I began to publish the work that I was doing about my experience of living with brain damage and with sudden illness was how large a community I was actually writing for, how so many of us have either experienced sudden change in our life, maybe from illness, maybe from injury, maybe from loss. How many of us have experienced things that have forced us to redefine who we are and how we do what we need to do. And that was brought home to me as people began to write and call in response to what I was publishing. So there was this sense that without even having to think of it, there was an audience. There was a kind of universal sense of a shared experience that I was giving voice to. I was fortunate enough not to have been so damaged that I was completely silenced, where so many people are. And so I also came to understand that I was giving voice to something that many people weren't able to give voice to, but many people were feeling. So it was brought home to me that there was an audience, but it wasn't an audience that I was consciously trying to find.
When you're talking...
Can I say one more thing?
Oh, yes.
Because you said something, Brian, that was really important that, as an educator, I've seen shift really intensely over 20 years of teaching, that it's completely appropriate to make art or write, maybe, I don't know that to be true there, for an audience of one. And that wasn't always true. It used to be that there was this kind of universalist or generalist attitude about making work, and it was for the greatest amount of people that you could possibly get to, and that the message really had to be larger and sort of common and stuff like that. And I absolutely think that is not true. You can make extremely specific work that is only for this very single audience, and everybody else that sees it, that's great, but it's not about you. And if you want to engage in that, that's great, but otherwise it's really for those 6 people that are sitting over on that side of the room. And that's a real shift in art making, and it's actually incredibly freeing to not have to take this sort of generalist approach to the way that you think about making. And that's a real distinct shift I've seen. I tell my students now, I'm like, feel free to make it for an audience of 1, which I never would have felt comfortable saying before.
It seems like societies maybe sometimes have certain needs that are kind of picked up subconsciously by the people making stuff. And I think now we're so saturated by, you could say media imagery and that sort of thing, that I think one of the things nowadays that people generally kind of thirst for is some kind of authenticity. And so maybe now more than a generation ago, they're kind of willing to make the leap looking at art, that it isn't about them and it isn't that universal expression, but they can understand somebody kind of on a sort of quest for self-expression and meaning, and there ends up, like Floyd said, being some kind of commonalities that come from that, but maybe some of the universality that used to exist in art was a product of a kind of different time and a different generation where, you know, people might have had to come together for things like world wars or what have you, whereas now there's kind of a little bit more of a fracturing that goes on in terms of expression. And the technology, of course, enables a lot of that too, because there are all these tribes all over the world that you know, have something in common, whether it's, you know, wrestling with neurological issues or, you know, for me, I communicate with Oregon Ducks fans all over the world too, you know, and it can be something serious or frivolous, and so it's a, you know, you're always a kind of a product of your times and your technologies and tools available to you and that stuff.
Or making very personal art, right? Do you find that people have any kind of perception about the fact that you're making that work in Portland?
Yes. Yeah. Some people don't like it. But and other people, someone called me brave the other day, and I felt very good about that. I thought that was a very nice compliment. But I just feel like I'm the person that's willing to do it. A lot of people aren't, and that's fine, but my personality suits making that kind of work, and so I'm willing to be the person that's going to put that out there.
You're always dealing with expectations that people have going in about you or the place you come from, and so if they're looking at you in some kind of biennial or other show as where they're thinking about you as a Portland artist or an Oregon artist first, they're going to bring a whole set of expectations. When I went to college in New York, I was just absolutely astonished at some of the ignorant misconceptions I would hear. I mean, I was routinely asked if we had electricity, if we had paved roads, and so, you know, somebody who thinks that way about Oregon, that it's just a bunch of lumberjacks, are going to, you know, bring that set of expectations in. And thankfully, I'm speaking in sort of stereotypical terms that most educated people in another city or another community would have a little bit more intelligence than that. But, you know, we all want to kind of shorthand places too. Like if somebody says Long Island, I'd probably in a few seconds start going into my sort of crass Long Island imitation when, you know, people don't really all sound like a Baldwin brother there, but that's just my perception of them. So, you know, if you're an artist identified as part of a geographical community, you're always dealing with the perceptions that exist there. But luckily, that's part of what's changing for Portland, is that we're being viewed as a place that people want to be and not just a place of isolation. And luckily, the beautiful mountains and valleys and such, that natural landscape hasn't gone away. But there isn't that isolation. So that's what's exciting to me, that kind of, I feel like a little bit we're getting to have our cake and eat it too, but that's kind of what the set of conditions are for a city to become a lot more relevant to the rest of the world.
Yeah, John Raymond said once that it used to feel like we were behind a one-way mirror, and now we're behind a two-way mirror, like other people can see us. We can reflect out. Floyd, you talk to readers and writers all over the world, and you're from Brooklyn originally. Do you have an impression of how perceptions of Portland has changed over the years?
Well, I know that when I chose to move to Oregon in 1984, I felt like I was coming to the land of Ken Kesey and Ursula Le Guin and Bill Stafford. I was coming to a place with a rich literary heritage and tradition and presence. I didn't feel like I was going to the artistic boonies. Although I'm aware, being a New Yorker, that there's this perception that if you're creating literature out here, if you're writing out here, you're probably writing cowboy stuff or you know, hick stuff or whatever. But I don't think that endures anymore. And I certainly didn't come out here with that expectation. I felt like I was coming to a place with a tremendously rich literary soil. And it's continued. The younger writers who are working here, I'm in my 60s now. And when I see the work that's being produced by writers from their 20s to their 40s, I'm very, very impressed. So this is not any longer a place, if it ever was, that justifies condescension from the folks back east. And one of the finest young nonfiction writers I can think of, a woman in her 30s who just happens to be my daughter, has just published a book that spent 9 weeks so far on the New York Times bestseller list. And I guess she did that despite being from Portland. But, you know, there's remarkable work being done in the literary arts here. It doesn't feel at all like the sticks. I got to be sharp to keep up.
I think a big part of it is, I think to a degree, Portland has always been an attractor of young creative people. And what I would hope is maybe different is that more of them feel like it's okay to stay now. Like I think whether it's visual art or other disciplines, there's a history here of people who have made an impact or found themselves in some way as a creative person earlier in their career in Portland, but then they made their name elsewhere. You could look at Mark Rothko, the painter. You could even look at something totally different like James Beard, who became sort of like the first famous food writer or food personality. You know, Oregon shaped him, but he had to go away to sort of become famous. Or you could even look at somebody like Gus Van Sant, who is kind of came to Oregon from somewhere else, and a couple of times over has left and come back. But it's a little different when you get to that rarefied air as any kind of artist like, you know, Gus Van Sant has. But at the same time, there's definitely, I think, it's true that there's more of a feeling that you can do what you want to do from here and not feel like you have to make a migration to New York or LA anymore.
Do you think the fact that we're in an urban center that's surrounded by forests, that has really close ties to wilderness, affects how we come to our work here compared to the more intensely built environment of the East?
I think it's definitely about the landscape. You know, I remember doing an interview with Brad Klopfeld, the architect, and he said that his biggest influence was Mount Hood. And I remember when they were building the aerial tram here, you know, the architect argued that they had been told that, instructed to design something that had a postcard-like quality, and the architect said, you know, you have your postcard, it's Mount Hood, so that's inevitably going to affect you. I remember when I went to NYU, I was so excited, you know, to be in New York City and everything, and amongst all these film students, but the hot movie, or not the hot movie, sort of the hot pop cultural entity of the time was Twin Peaks, which was so much about the woods of the Northwest. And I just had to kind of laugh that I had to go all the way to New York myself, you know, like a lot of people had, only to, you know, see this art about the Northwest. And, you know, David Lynch was a Northwesterner who had to leave and who went to Philadelphia and kind of had a traumatic experience. And so, like, he's another example of that, a Northwesterner who wrestles with that kind of urbanity versus landscape and, you know, searching for the right cultural balance.
I kind of feel like what you're talking about is regionalism a little bit too, and I don't necessarily think that that's what, like, I don't, like, I look at my own work and I don't need those trees in order to make my work, and that's not necessarily about that, but there is a tone, and I think of a Michael Brophy only because you brought him up, where, you know, he is really driven by that, and the work absolutely reflects that tone, but I don't think it's a necessity in the making anymore. Something that's really shifted in terms of visual arts too is just the level of, in order to have a really vibrant visual art community, you need to have many different factors. You need to have money and collectors and curators and artists and galleries and good ones and bad ones and all the stuff in between, and people showing in cafes, and all of that needs to be part of a vibrant community, and it's something that Portland hasn't had until recently, I would say. And one of the biggest boons that we've had is curators coming in, because curators are who get artists out. And so that has kind of leveled that playing field where that, where it's become more of a global sensibility or a larger conversation, so that the trees don't kind of hold us back.
So it can be more about the conceptual framing.
Yeah.
Although I do think, and you know, tell me what you think of this, that there tends to be a pairing of the conceptual framing with these very interesting older techniques. hand techniques and craft references.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a long history that we've both struggled with and embraced. So, and I feel like we're in a place where we can do it all right now, and we're not being judged as much for it anymore. Dale Chihuly doesn't loom over the Pacific Northwest anymore. But, you know, that there's just a lot more that's getting informed, and that handicrafted kind of thing is equally as important as that conceptual framework for building work from at this point.
Yeah.
My initial thought when I was thinking about your question, is it the proximity of the woods and the mountains and so on that does something special to the sense of life in this urban center? And it occurred to me, you know, I grew up in Brooklyn and Long Island, and in Brooklyn I was 7 minutes from the beach. We forget that Brooklyn and New York City have a natural presence all around them. You know, I spent a lot of time on the beach as a little boy. And then we moved to this little barrier island off the south shore of Long Island. And I went to high school in a community that I had a boardwalk, and there was a beach, and kids were surfing. In fact, that's the only reason I was able to play high school football, because all the good athletes were surfing. So I grew up in a place where it was very easy to get close to nature. And I still see the imagery of beaches that rebuild themselves annually, and as a result of natural erosion occurring in my work. And, you know, it's a different natural setting here. But not every urban center is without a natural framework around it.
So
Ohio may be something else, but
so then what's different about the role of the natural world here, would you say?
I'm not very good at abstract thinking, but what I would say is I surrendered to it here. It was everywhere, and I moved out into it. And gave up what the yearning or the sense of need of being in the urban setting itself. And I surrendered to the natural.
What I'm hearing there is that, and I think is true, is that you can be really enveloped by nature here. You can find pockets of nature in every city in America. But only certain places can you go and feel like you just kind of surrender to not only the majesty of it, but the size, that there's so much of it. Like when people from the East Coast fly into Portland, if they land in the daytime, I routinely hear from them just about the experience of going over the hundreds of miles of evergreen trees and seeing the peaks. And I think that's the difference is, you know, it's the same whether you're in Washington State or, you know, Colorado, Utah, places where there's a particularly striking landscape, that it's that sense of, even if you're in a metropolitan city, that you're still an outpost amongst this gigantic swatch of nature. And so I think that's what's different from maybe an East Coast city. And that is really a good reminder that New York and any city really has bits of access to nature. The Meadowlands outside of New York and New Jersey are associated with stereotypes like the mafia dumping bodies. But it's, you know, as a Portland writer showed in his book about the Meadowlands, it's this incredible natural setting that, yes, has been damaged, but is a humongous wetlands area. So, but I think that's the difference, that the Meadowlands in New York or some of the beaches going up Long Island would be just not the same scale as some of the West, and the amount of space we have out here. The other thing I was thinking about is my partner works for Adidas, who has their American headquarters here in Portland, and a common recurrence when you talk to the German employees that work at Adidas in Portland about what they like about the United States or what they find special, routinely the answer for them is the space, that you can just sort of disappear either into the woods or also kind of in that sort of like in that scene, like I'm thinking of this scene in my own private Idaho, out into the desert of Oregon. And I think that's another thing about Oregon. It isn't one thing. It's mountains and forests and valleys and beaches and desert, and there's this incredible variety of nature. And so you can not just escape into the trees, but to the beach or to any number of different types of wild nature around here.
There's something about being able to disappear like that that's also, I think, very contemplative. It's an opportunity for quiet, maybe. Maybe that's what's more important about the nature than just making pictures of trees.
There's an assumption that you will have that experience when you come to Oregon. I mean, anybody, and it's true. I just moved 7 minutes out of the city, and you would think that I'm, living in your yurt in Amityville, or not Amityville. Amityville. Amity. Just Amity. But it's very, we call it.
Yeah. It's interesting that you guys brought up Gus Van Sant and David Lynch, because I think they're also examples not just of there being a role of the natural world, but also of a certain darkness. And I think there's a lot of people who come from Oregon who make work that's fairly dark, like also Catherine Dunn. Some other people would be more recently Chuck Palahniuk, also Raymond Carver. Why do you think that is? Where does that come from?
Weather. That was my only
also,
answer for you.
The woods look at, what Floyd was saying about being surrendering to the woods. I mean, part of why I would infer that you use the word surrender is that really, for all the, teddy bears we may have or, postcard pictures of the woods, nature is an unforgiving place, the state of nature, and that nobody cares if you live or die, and something is likely to eat you tomorrow. Or if you want to continue living, you have to kill something and eat it. That sort of, I think, or we may go hiking here on a nice trail, but you make one wrong turn and get a little disoriented, and suddenly you're lost, and there are Air National Guard units and helicopters looking for you because you've been enveloped by nature. And so, I think of that word surrender, and that it's taking a bit of a risk in a way when you delve into nature. It isn't a preconditioned environment.
So it makes it easier to take risk, maybe.
And I obviously there's something to the weather, and there's something to the indifferent power of nature that we're in. But there's a flip side, I think, of why there's so much dark work produced here, and I think it's because a lot of people with darkness in their soul find themselves at home here. Not only at home because of the nature, because of the rain, but because we have a great tolerance here for the weird. And it's a place where you can be true to yourself without having to be too current or too pop or too hip. You can just be true to yourself in your art and make your art out of that source, and you'll be accepted for it here in a way that you might not in other places.
Another thing that occurs to me is that one might think of what we don't have as a city, like one of the other knocks against Portland from a cultural perspective is, if you were saying it bluntly, you would say Portland is very white, and that we don't have the cultural diversity of a lot of cities on the East Coast, even ones that are the same size as us. And I think when you have more of a melting pot or a greater diversity, there inevitably is a little bit more friction. But when you have a kind of more homogeneous place, then that creates a different set of conditions too. And if I were to think of Portland being kind of a white place, that would lead me to thinking of it as being a sort of like a child of like Scandinavia and England and stuff like that. And then, like Floyd was saying, maybe if Portland has a little bit of a dark side to it, I think maybe there is something to do with climate, and not only is it a place that's isolated from cultural capitals, but it's a sort of like a climate that some people would find gloomy just because of the grayness of it and that sort of thing. Seasonal affective disorder is a genuine phenomenon. So that all the stuff sort of percolates in and becomes one of the sort of things in the soil, and then whatever creative work comes out of it, I think of it in that metaphor, like there are all these different influencing factors internationally, locally, and then the soil springs something out of that that's sort of the result of a diverse array of things.
I know that you've mentioned, Nan, that this is a place that you take more risk. Do you think that is part of what Floyd was talking about, that people are more accepting of taking risk, and that kind of makes it possible to explore more confrontational or dark subject matter?
Yeah, actually, I think that's very true. I mean, I certainly feel like I've surrounded myself with a community that absolutely supports that kind of risk-taking. So, and I came from Cincinnati, Ohio, so I was pretty ready to take a risk. So, I mean, and it is and was ripe for that. I mean, I definitely think that Portland encourages that. It's a nice way of saying it. Like, we like the weirdos.
Yeah. Do you think people have a very clear vision of what Portland art is like?
We have a very clear vision of what Portland art is like.
Yeah.
I think that's very fluid in that both the outside world and we are trying to still figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be getting more sophisticated and open-ended every time we think that we've figured out what that is. Mm-hmm. It's much less pigeonholed. It's much less about a kind of regional sensibility, though I'm not really sure from the inside it was about regionalism. It was about someone sort of imposing that on us. So I mean, the doors seem to be opening much more for that.
And so many people are coming to the area from other places, and I think ultimately that's a huge strength for us, and that we're getting, particularly now, but to a degree throughout our history, an influx of people who are making a conscious choice to come here. And so there's a kind of pride of place that exists, but also the reason they come here, like we've talked about, is to have a degree of freedom as well. I talked earlier about people coming in to farm and start a family, but I think there's also a kind of maverick quality that exists as one of the qualities of the West in general. But when you have a place that's sort of a destination of a long migration, people who are willing to make that kind of journey in a covered wagon and all that stuff, those were our sort of original culture. And so I think that we're sort of replenishing that notion of Portland and Oregon as being a place of immigrants where people come. But as a result of that, you don't have the long traditions and foundations. You're kind of making something new. And it's harder when you don't have as much to fall back on. You're having to kind of maybe in some ways reinvent the wheel a little bit more, but there's an excitement that comes from the fact that you feel like you can really be a part of something. You look at Portland and the really high degrees of like neighborhood involvement and stuff. I think that's reflective of the culture here in the same way that it was for me, feeling like I could just make a film instead of ask a producer's permission or something.
Yeah.
I don't think in the literary world there's a prayer of anybody trying to say this is a Portland School of Art, Portland School of Writing. It's just, if anything, the expectation would have to be that you can't pigeonhole the writing that comes out of this place at all. I mean, it can be, who was expecting a Chuck Palahniuk, and then there he was, and who writes like Kesey wrote at the time Kesey was writing, and Catherine Dunn, and there are just so many unique writers making work here, and people writing across genres, people doing work in the novel and in poetry and in creative nonfiction. If anything, I think we're getting a reputation as being rich with unexpected talent.
That's wonderful. All right, well, gosh, thanks so much for talking with me. And we're going to move now to letting the audience talk with you a little bit. Okay, does not want to show us the poster, but that's okay. All right, so does anyone have a question? And also, I should say, sorry to interrupt you, we are recording, so if you would please make use of, Karen is the microphone runner, so she's going to be right there with you.
Well, the last thing you're just saying, I mean, great Oregon writers go back to Joaquin Miller and Homer Davenport, and can we look at like Northern California or Utah or Montana or even Washington producing writers like that? Well, or Ken Kesey. But I mean, okay, Homer Davenport. Anybody?
What do you think about that, Floyd?
You know, I really don't want to say that we're better than the Washington people and we're better than the Montanans and the Northern Californians. I'm sure there are rich and remarkable historical figures in those places too. But I'm struck over and over again by the breadth of original talent that seems to emerge from here. And it's people who come here from other places and found their voices. It's people who were born and raised here and bring a unique set of gifts to it. But I do have a very strong feeling that we have a tremendously rich present literary culture and a strong historical one going way back. It's remarkable for a small, quote, out-of-the-way place like this.
It does go back really decades, I mean, to the beats even.
I think a lot of it is also just exposure. You know, I think every region and every place where people live is going to produce artists and writers to some degree, but just the simple fact that Portland is geographically a long way from New York and places where, at least in the old world, media was created from, they're just going to be less aware of something happening on the other side of the country. It's that kind of, it's like in the New Yorker magazine cartoon where everything is kind of a desert once you get to the other side of the Hudson River. And you know, I've kind of bashed New York a couple of times, which is funny because I'm the one who sought out to go there. But I think you know, it becomes indicative of like that sort of love-hate relationship where you're seeking. There are things that you love about a place, and there are things that you hate about a place, and whether it's Portland or New York or Timbuktu, that's always going to be the case.
Yeah, I just saw Lauren Weedman came to town. She was a writer on The Daily Show, and she said LA was like her abusive boyfriend. He'd like buy her car and then slap her across the face. And actually, she said something very interesting, that people should stay in Portland as long as they can because it's very supportive of developing your particular work, your voice.
Well, I find it interesting, one theory I heard that was originated in a Willamette Week cover story several years ago that I read. And it was the purpose of that story was to compare Portland and Seattle, but quoted in the story was a Portland State University urban studies professor who pointed out the difference historically, at least in general terms, between river cities and ocean port cities, and that his hypothesis was that ocean port cities tended to have a little bit more of a tendency to want to show the world how kind of big and important they were, and river cities often tended to be a little bit more insular, maybe less ambitious, but also a little bit more sure of themselves. And I think, you know, you could find lots of cities for which that's generally not true, like London or Paris. Those are river cities that are big, important world cities. But I think it is surprisingly indicative of like a Seattle versus Portland. Like I look at the architecture and the design of those two cities and what's great about each one. If you were looking at it from an architectural perspective, you'd see Seattle having more buildings than Portland that are designed by famous architects, but you'd have just about everybody agreeing that Portland was more successful at creating a kind of what architects and designers would call an urban fabric, the collection of buildings and the relationship between them and with the pedestrian. And so I remember, it's kind of a corny line, but once when I was writing about this, I said, in terms of architecture, it's like Seattle has like a couple of diamonds and Portland is a string of pearls. And I think, it comes back to that river city, ocean port city thing, and that, there are ways subconsciously in which your environment affects you and affects the culture. And maybe you're not this, outdoorsman who writes or makes art about trees and forests, but just the kind of general conditions end up affecting you whether you realize it or not.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe now that the technology exists, the difference is it's easier for people to find out about us. Who else? I see a couple hands up. Miss Brown.
Hello. I wanted to suggest that I wanted to ask you guys about this alleged weirdness that we embrace here. I'm the director of the co-presenting organization here, New Oregon, and we arose out of a nonprofit org called Two Girls Performative Arts. And you want weird. Two Girls brought weird to Portland and supported really radical artwork and performance that was being made here. And I felt that we constantly ran into this kind of, you mentioned kind of a Scandinavian, uptight Protestant heritage vibe here. And I'm from Oregon, and I went to a Lutheran church with a bunch of Scandinavians. And I also lived in the Bay Area in New York. So some things that aren't really considered that weird in, other cities where I've lived, here we're met with just this complete dismissal. People were freaked out by naked bodies. We were bringing Ron Athey to town, who's a very famous performance artist, but works with controversial bodily fluids. And we were told by a local art college that Ron Athey will never set foot on this campus. So I see both of those Oregons, both of those Portlands. We like quirky, but we're scared of blood. What do you guys think of that? What's that about?
But you could get away with it now. It's like a matter of exposure.
2 years ago.
Oh, really? Oh, I just feel like Portland needs exposure, and like each time, the first time is always the hardest, and the next time it's going to get a little bit easier, and next time it's going to get a little. That's what I feel like that weirdness comes from, and the more that they get exposed, the more that there is that kind of embrace of that bodily fluid.
I think I really hear what you're saying, and I think about my own experiences growing up here and then sort of coming back as an adult to Portland really jive with that, and that you've got some elements of the sort of indigenous, or not indigenous culture, but the generations of people living here that is very conservative, and that's represented for me by some of my family members who all live outside of Portland in particular. And then you've got a sort of insular environment in Portland, in the sense that Portland is a pretty liberal city amongst a more conservative rural area. And I think that's kind of one of the things about our culture in general that exists is the kind of urban-rural divide. And some of what we've been talking about tonight has been about breaking down those barriers, but they still exist. Like, I remember, even aside from our own culture, I remember hearing a statistic that John Kerry in 2004 got a majority vote in every single U.S. city that had more than 500,000 people. So that means John Kerry, even in losing to George W. Bush, carried Dallas, Atlanta, Phoenix, all these supposed bastions of conservatism. And so I think that's, whether as Oregonians and Portlanders, but also as, Clevelandites or whatever the case may be, people are struggling with those urban-rural divides, which are informed by some of those differences in culture, conservative and liberal, which is not to say that there aren't liberal people living in rural areas or conservative people living in urban areas, but definitely those would be the stronger tendencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's kind of true. The gentleman in the blue jacket?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's a little hard to have this conversation without really focusing a lot on the history of the area, both with in terms of our culture and also our politics and our social fabric. I mean, like in eastern Oregon, the Klan was big up until the like the 30s and 40s, and I think we forget that. And the other thing that comes to mind is that part of this, shall we say, conservatism or lack of acceptance or trouble in dealing with some of the more cutting edge things from outside the area, we sometimes forget that the scene really only started exploding like in the early 90s. And up until that time, it was really pretty provincial. So this is a really young scene.
Which scene are you talking about?
The Portland art scene.
Art scene.
Yes, the
Okay.
art scene.
Okay, I didn't know.
In answering this point, and so I mean, like what we're in right now is in the middle of a growth spurt that I think is so dramatic that a lot of people are still getting a handle on exactly what's happening. I think, as I was talking to Brian before the thing, what we need to do right now is really get a grip on where we're at and start claiming our mantle and getting some sound bites and together about where we're at, what separates us from a lot of the other art scenes, and then also start building up a repository that will give us a history of how we got to where we're at. So I'm kind of all over the map there, but.
Yeah, I was I actually, in reflecting and hearing you coin it as the art scene, I think we do have a pretty conservative art community, and that is true that it's only begun. I mean, we came out of a craft history. Again, we were looming in the shadow of Chihuly. We've got a long history of the handmade object. So, and all of this is influencing where we are. And I would say 90s, yeah, you're probably right about there. So they're not quite sure how to handle Ron Athey, or even a Nan Curtis sometimes, which really is not a Ron Athey. But I would definitely say that we're still in that process. And it only happens. I'm always surprised at the way that, 3 years later you could bring Ron and everybody like, why haven't we had him here before? It's like, geez Louise, so it hears itself, it grows each time, but it is a pretty young, we'll say young and not immature.
And then in contrast, even though maybe you couldn't have done it on a college campus, in the Everett Street Lofts, they've been doing that kind of stuff for a number of years. And so it's been out there, but just not necessarily in our academic establishment.
And certainly not anywhere where there's money.
Well, I mean, and this is, I mean, the whole scene this is about two different scenes. This is about the establishment, and this is about the emerging art scene here. And it's the emerging art scene that the whole country is looking at here in Portland, because we have a nice, traditional gallery scene and strong academics. But it's that maverick, do-it-yourself, anything goes emerging scene that the rest of the country is really excited about and is drawing attention.
What do you think?
It reminds me of when I was in college, and we would have these conversations about a rock band that was maybe a punk band or something like that, and a lot of its sort of DNA was that sort of outsider mentality, and there was a lot of pride that they weren't on a major label, and then a major label would come calling. And a lot of them would sign with major labels anyway. And at the time, we would use all this language of whether or not they sold out. That was always kind of the question. But I think some of the way I remember thinking about that whole issue is comparable to what Portland faces, in that going through this process that is true for both individuals and groups and societies and cities, and that you start out as more of an outsider and you kind of learn to do things yourself and take a certain pride in getting your hands dirty and not waiting for anybody's permission. But then the world starts to take notice, and a lot more opportunities come your way, and you get a lot of resources, but in exchange, there's the risk that a little part of you is going to be lost along the way. And so you have to kind of decide for yourself, what is the right place for you, that, how much money is enough, or how much freedom am I willing to give up, and how much authenticity am I willing to sacrifice to get kind of more power or whatever it is that I'm seeking. And so I think that's true for, you know, the garage band that wants to have a lot of people hear their music but doesn't want to be considered some, you know, corporate toy. And it's true for a city that is used to thinking about is very used to being perceived as the sticks, but knows it has something really special brewing. I think Portland is in kind of a special moment in that you've got this huge influx of people, and the culture and the art scene are being energized and transformed in ways that we couldn't possibly figure out, you know, tonight or over the course of the next year. But it is true, I think, that Portland would be well served to kind of accept that mantle to a degree, as long as you know, that piece of us that gets sacrificed isn't too large too. That I remember interviewing the co-head of Widening Kennedy a couple years ago and saying, you know, what is it about Portland that you think is making it special, that why kids from Japan or China or Europe want to come here and experience Portland? And he said, he talked, the two words I remember him using were outsider and authenticity. And I think those are really key. And so it's a question of, you know, again, how we maintain that sort of outsider DNA, but also, you know, grow up a little bit too. You know, as it happens, it's okay in some respects to sign to a major label if you're a rock band. You're not automatically a sellout if you do that. I mean, the Beatles, who are the Mozart of the 20th century, were on a major label, and for me, that's really all you have to say about that. But I also know that there are bands like, you know, for me it was Fugazi when I was in college, that instead of signing to a major label, created their own label and ended up, you know, getting their music heard in new ways. And so I think with Portland, part of what we're talking about is, although it's great to have the validation of the New York Times and that sort of thing, like that old, small, highly centralized world of media and culture doesn't really exist anymore because of some of the technologies and some of the other changes that have gone on. And so I think the good news is we can sort of, I feel like I see a way, and we see a way, that we can be ourselves and go forward as something that's a bigger presence in the world, without just becoming the next, you know, boring urban megalopolis. But because it's all fluid and all constantly changing, you know, it remains an open-ended question.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, everybody. And we're going to do our raffle now. So, Karen, would you like to bring the fishbowl up here? And let's see, should we do the book first? What do you think? Did everybody get a chance? Anyone want to put their card in? All right. Should do this blindfolded. Okay. Let's see. Oh, Andrew Cheka. Oh no. Okay. Got to be present to win. All right, Nan. Let's see. Emily Steen. Are you here today? She was here. Let's see. Cole Haver. All right. Let's give him a hand. Very nice. He has one patient 002.
It's patient 002.
Oh, 002. Pardon me.
Like Agent 007.
I should have gotten the reference. Okay, our next prize is, this is conceptual only at this moment in time, but Brian will be contacting you within the next day or so. Let's see, do we have Josh Ashcroft in the house? Oh, congratulations, Josh. Woo!
And the conceptual is 2 DVDs that I forgot to bring, but are at my house. So I'm good for it.
Thank you for clarifying that, Brian. Okay, and last is there an Aaron Donovan in the house? All right, woohoo, you win a personal tour by Nan Curtis. There you go. All right, thank you all for coming. The food and bar will stay open for half an hour if you'd like to mingle, and have a great evening.
And my wife and I are selling copies of my books, which I will inscribe for you, to my best friend, whatever you want. Just buy books.
Oh, and I should also say thanks once again to the University of Oregon, to Karen Monroe, and to New Old Lompoc for their generous donation of tonight's refreshments. And you can also purchase Brian's work in the Ducks shop if you'd like to. Thank you.
No, just the Ducks. Great. I'll give you a copy of my book.